Thank you. I've just told Michael that MBE stands for more bikes everywhere. So anyway, right. I'd really like to thank you for inviting me to Ireland. Whenever I'm at a public meeting, whether that's in a local community or a city, town or whatever, I always say that I'm not here to tell you what to do. You've got to find your own solutions. But hopefully what I can do is talk about what is happening elsewhere, and maybe that will give you some ideas and inspiration to do some things yourself. I have to apologise because for much of my presentation I'm going to be talking in those old units, and I mean miles per hour, but I do make some if like change to kilometres per hour in some places. So I hope you'll understand that 20 miles per hour is equal to 32 kilometres per hour, and 30 miles per hour is equal to 48 or roughly 50k. So 20 is plenty for us. We're a national voluntary organisation, and we support communities who want lower speeds for residential streets. And what we mean by that is 20 mile an hour default limit on streets, what we call total 20. It's not speed bumps, and really it's for all residential roads with exceptions determined by the local road authority, which would usually mean arterial roads which are decided separately. It's very much about retrofitting communities for active travel, and one important aspect is that if you want behaviour change within communities by people who are in communities, then what better way than to start with those communities? So it's very much community-led, but most importantly is establishment endorsed. The fact that we're talking about mandatory speed limits is very important, and everything which goes with that. And yes, we do want to transform the way that our urban and village roads are shared. And share is a very powerful word. It presents plenty of challenges for all of us in today's age. 20 is plenty for us. We were founded in 2007. We just focused on 20 mile an hour speed limits. And we have three roles: support local communities, lobby central government, and influence transport professionals. Now, well, that was 245, that was a couple of weeks ago. It's now 250. And that's local campaigns which are catalysts for change within the communities. We now have 14 million people living in towns who have a total 20 policy of 20 mile an hour for all residential streets. I suspect there might be more people living in England who are Irish with a 30-kilometre speed limit for the street where they live than there possibly are in Ireland. But that's debatable, I'm sure. Let's see if we can change that, though. It's very much about managing or moving lower speeds into the mainstream of transport planning and urban development, and I'm pleased that that's been happening in the UK, and really that we've been acknowledged as being a catalyst in that change. I really want to now give you a couple of perspectives about children. They're personal perspectives which come from the campaign, and that's children and the road network, and then children and the benefits they get from 20 mile an hour limits. First of all, children and the road network. Let's face it, it's adults who are killing children. That's the situation which we're faced with. And adults are killing children, and they are preventable deaths. There is also a fourfold skewing of child pedestrian deaths in deprived wards in the UK. So this is hitting our most deprived wards and area far more than it does the affluent suburbs. And as well as that, adults are killing parents, and I was pleased that that was mentioned before. And parent deaths have a very strong effect on children, but not only parents, uncles, grandparents as well. All of these have a significant effect on the mental well-being of our children. Our overuse of cars and their emissions is also killing children in two ways. Right, it's the asthma which comes from the air quality and diseases which come from that. But also it's the inactive travel and obesity. And if you look at the statistics with regard to the obesity and overweight within your children, it's the same as the UK. It's a problem. And it's a problem which, unless we do something about it, then that is going to cost us dearly in the future, right, as we and they get older. Our children are losing their independent mobility. And that's been happening in the UK. I'm sure it's happening here, right? And it's not in other countries. Sometimes I have people talk to me about, well, that's, that's a strategic route. We can't slow down traffic on that. But I would put it to you that society has no greater strategic route than that from home to school. And that is where we should really be saying every child has a right to choose their own mode of transport to get to school. Yet, 80% of child casualties in the UK are outside of school commutes. School zones and the area immediately around the school zone are not a priority. We need protection for those children throughout the whole community, where they will go to see their friends, go to the shops, or to see their grandparents. And also there is a huge cost to society from the school run. It takes time of parents to do that trip and back, and that's something which we have to break. And our children need to play. They need to play by getting to the park. They need to see the streeters play. They need to have active and mobile grandparents who aren't afraid, right, to go out and walk to their local community. And there is a realization which we must have that children have just as much right to use the roads as adults. But to do so, they have to walk and cycle. They cannot wrap themselves in the protection of 1.5 tons of steel in order to make sure they aren't hurt by the other people who are using that road. And it's us adults, or the adults in this relationship. We've seen how many problems children have in the whole area of road safety and protecting themselves. We cannot, as a decent and fair society, rely upon them to protect themselves on the roads which we are using as adults for primarily our convenience. And I think if I can take something from J.F. Kennedy, we should ask not what the child can do to avoid the driver, but what together we can do for the freedom of children. And we look at children in 20-mile-an-hour limits. Their perspective is very different from ours. From inside a warm, quiet car, 30 miles an hour, 50k may seem safe. But what about from the perspective of an 8-year-old standing at the side of the road from this height? What do they feel about vehicles going past at 50k? And also remember that in the distance a 20 mile an hour can stop, a 30 mile an hour car is still doing 24 miles per hour. So there's a huge difference in the ability, not only of survivability in terms of casualties, but into the avoidance of a collision in the first place. Primary school children cannot detect the speed of cars from looming. For primary age school children, relative speeds above 20 mile an hour fail to be registered. They just don't have the capacity to do so. And I'm quite often asked by drivers, well, 30 kilometers per hour, isn't it a bit difficult? You have to look at the speedo, right? Isn't that difficult? Right? You've got to do it all the time. Well, I can look down at the speedo in half a second. If we ask a child to cross the road, they have to look, they have to assess the distance the vehicles are away, they have to work out what speed the vehicles are doing, they have to work out what time it's going to take for the vehicle to reach where they are, how long will it take them to cross the road, and then they've got to make a decision about whether it's safe or no. And we complain about the time it takes to look at our speedo to check our speed. 20 mile an hour or 30k is backed by so many people who are responsible for the health of the children. The Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health in the UK backs a national 20 mile an hour limit. The National Institute for Clinical Excellence backs 20 mile an hour. Public Health backs 20 mile an hour for children, and local public health teams back it as well. And 20 mile an hour limits, lower speed are the foundation for active travel. In Edinburgh, cycling to school rose from 4% to 12% when they put in a large 20-mile-an-hour pilot. And it provides the basis for other engineering and segregated interventions where you do have higher speeds. And it restores the right for children to use their streets with a clear statement. And society at local and national level needs to make a very clear and unambiguous statement that these roads are for children and walkers and cyclists just as much as people in motor vehicles. And the way to do that is to say that we all have to engage in modifying our behaviour if we're going to share those roads equitably. And let's look at that at stopping distances. If we look at this, here is a 30 kilometres per hour car. It's in the dry, it's stopping in 10.8 metres. If we look at a 50 kilometres per hour car, it's taking 24 metres in order to come to a rest. And so what we get is that comparison between the two. And we have an injury and death zone beyond that 10.8 metres, right the way through to 24. So if you're in that area, you're going to get hit by the vehicle. But if you're in a 20-mile-an-hour area where the vehicle is doing 20, then that is the near-miss zone. That's the zone where you walk away. You actually say, it missed me. It didn't happen, right? I was okay. And that's the primarily difference between 20 miles an hour and 30 miles an hour. So let's look at some of the places it's being done in the UK. It's been done in Warrington, where I come from. They did 150 roads in a pilot, and they found a 27% reduction in casualties on the residential streets. It's done for the whole of Lancashire. It's done in Liverpool, at Sefton Council, which is near Liverpool. Wigan, St Helens, Bolton, Bury, Rochdale and Manchester City Council. The metropolitan boroughs of Manchester, that's 60% of them. It's done in Sheffield, the whole of the city of York, Darlington, Nottingham, Coventry, Birmingham City Council, 1.4 million people, where 90% of the roads will be set at 20 mile an hour, 30 kilometres per hour. Middlesbrough, Leicester, Newcastle, Calderdale. I'll come back to Calderdale in a minute. Edinburgh, 80% of the roads. And if we look at the London boroughs, Hackney, Islington, Camden, Greenwich, Lewisham, Waltham Forest, Southwark, Lambeth, Haringey, Croydon, Tower Hamlets and City of London. And City of London done there for the 400,000 people who walk into the City of London each day for work. So it's not only children, it's workers, it's pedestrians, it's where people live, shop, work and learn. And in fact, in inner London, it's 75% of inner London boroughs have a 20 mile an hour limit. And we can add these: Oxfordshire, Portsmouth, Cambridge, Bath, Brighton and Hove, Chichester and Southampton. Very interesting thing is that on some of these, this is not just seen as a road safety issue. The benefits of lower speeds go way, way, way beyond direct casualties. And that is why in these places, public health are contributing to the funding. And that is a key to the funding, right, of lower speed limits. You look at all the elements of government which will actually gain from this in future generations, and you say that's where we should take the funding from rather than all coming from road safety. In Liverpool, 43% of the total costs were from public health. Manchester, first phase was fully funded by public health. And in Calderdale, 50% was coming from funded public health. That's £500,000 to do the engineering and implementation, and another £500,000 going on engagement. And I'll come back to engagement because it is an absolutely essential part of making this behaviour change. This is not about putting some signs on some sticks and then expecting the police to sort the resulting mess out. It's about all parties engaging to make sure that the police have a role to play, but it's not a role which is 100% on their shoulders. It's about multi-agency collaboration across councils and authorities. And if we look at London, I've said about 75% of the inner London boroughs Even with Transport for London, who manage the arterial road network within London, they are looking at 20 miles per hour on some of their sections of road where there's busy high streets and so on. So there really is a change in the UK, that it's not a case of where you should put 20 mile an hour limits, but where you shouldn't put them. Right. Why not 20 mile an hour? So, and indeed, you can have a tourist coming into the UK, comes in by Eurostar and goes to a station in Camden, it goes to Oxford, it goes to Cambridge, it goes to York, it goes down up to Edinburgh, down to Liverpool, passes through the Lancashire 20 mile an hour county, down to Bristol, Bath, back to London, and it's only been in 20 mile an hour towns and cities. So that's the extent of it. And it's really so much better for tourists because, you know, one of the things is tourists come over here and, you know, not only is the traffic fast, but they've arranged it so that the cars come from the opposite direction from where you're expecting. So something like this is important for tourism and making tourists feel comfortable as well. There are some tipping trends in it. Those tipping trends are public health. It really is being perceived the wide benefits from public health, not only in direct casualties, but getting transport emissions down and health, increasing modal shift towards walking and cycling so people don't have so many cars on the road, and the reduction in obesity and active travel. There's international standards with the UN Decade of Road Safety. The EU strongly recommends 30 kilometres per hour for all roads unless you have segregated provision for cyclists. And it's happening in all the bigger cities, Tokyo, London, Paris, New York, Milan, Barcelona. It's all being looked at in terms of 30 kilometres per hour limits going in. Certainly in the UK, we've had progressive easing and flexibility on guidance on 20 mile an hour limits for almost every one of the past 5 years. It's been made easier as central government has seen the change which is wanted in local authorities as they, if you like, want to put in 20 mile an hour limits and want to do it more cost effectively. And there are the cultural changes, reduced car ownership, active travel. The British Social Attitude Survey is done every year, and it found that 73% of people agree that 20 mile an hour, 30k is the right speed limit for residential roads. This is what people think is right, but it is converting that desire, that aspiration, into the reality of setting a 30 kilometres per hour speed limit. And again, if we look at this in terms of public health, and this was a slide I pinched off a public health director. If we look at deaths in 2008 in the UK on the roads, 115 cyclists were killed, 2,500 people altogether were killed on the road. 32,000 people died prematurely of chronic heart disease, which was attributed to inactivity. And those are the costs which society is paying. And the society is paying all the health costs prior to that premature death as well. There's a key realization in communities that inappropriate vehicle speeds, it actually violates our public spaces. It creates fear, apprehension, and conflict that far exceeds any benefits to those communities. Speed is the main factor in collision avoidance and casualty severity. It's not that speed causes collisions so much as speed not allowing the collision to be avoided or the consequences mitigated. And of course there's that realization that a 20 mile an hour place is a better place for everyone. Whether you're driving, whether you're shopping, whether you're cycling, whether you're walking, or whether you're just standing at the side of the road chatting. The key point is that a city that permits 50 kilometres per hour on residential roads will never, ever be child-friendly, and it will always deter physical activity. And I would say that there is a moral point as well, that speed becomes greed when it's a thing which stops us and our children from walking or cycling on our and their roads through the fear of traffic. So how can local communities mobilise and create that change? And can this be adopted to become an Irish solution? Well, the first thing and this has gone through a 9-point cycle, which we have seen over and over again in the UK in our campaigns and where communities have transitioned to 20 mile an hour. There's a realization that there's something wrong with the way we're using the roads. And I sense this at this conference, and I sense it with the RSA people I see. Right, there's something which isn't right, which we've got to change. That might be a big ship which takes a long while to change direction, right? And there might be some practical difficulties there. But I feel that the urge and the aspiration is there. So some things say we've got something wrong. And then the community aspires to lower its speeds, whether that be at local level or whether it be at national level. Usually in the UK, they phone me up. They form a campaign. They get empowerment from our website with the information and briefing sheets. We've got 50 of them. Have a look on our website. There's some sample of some of them outside which we can look at. And so they decide to form a local 20's Plenty for Us campaign. They set that up and they start to have that debate. And debate is so important for transforming and moving this initiative from the planners and from national government and from the officers into the community. Because at the end of the day, it's the community which has to own this. It's the community which has to have that behaviour change. So you have to have that debate at all levels around that. And you're campaigning as people and citizens. And you're writing to doctors, involving the directors of public health. And most of all, for politicians, both local and national, you're making that public support tangible. You're empowering them to do the right thing. And then that is when the politicians get drawn in. And I've got to say it's about the quality and it's not about the colour of politics. If a politician has empathy and understands his constituents, then they're going to be appreciative of what this can do to empower them and make their place better. It's very much about active travel, independent child and elderly mobility, etc. But it's important to have a vision of making a better place to be and establishing that moral, financial and political imperative for change. And then what happens is you look at the costing options. You're involving the professionals locally. What's going to be included, what's going to be excluded from it? You plan a rollout. Should we do it all at once in a small community, or should we do it in phases? In many places, about 200,000 population in the UK, they've taken about 2 to 3 years to do that, which gives you a guide. It can't be done instantly. It takes time to engineer that, to work it all out, to administer it, to plan it. You plan for engagement, which is so important. You look at the funding alternatives, and that's way beyond road safety, and that's so important. You involve public health, you involve education, you talk about, if you like, the development of child, if you like, sociability, their ability for independent mobility, and so on. And you create that multidisciplinary implementation team across all departments. It's not just road safety trying to do it all on themselves or the traffic engineers. It's wider, because this is something which is going to benefit the whole community. So the traffic authority locally makes a decision, it authorises it to implement, and then in doing so, it works with health, raises traffic regulation orders for lots of roads at one time. It has engagement and engagement and engagement. So important. Listening to the objections, identifying the insights, designing a message about what's right for your community and what it will mean for your community. And arranging some light touch enforcement as well. It's very important that the police communicate that message that yes, we're not going to be on every street corner, with a speed gun measuring your speed, right? But we will be out there on some days in some places. So we do mean it, because that's the role of the police, right, to do that. And what's the result? Well, you're going to speed and it'll drop by something between 0 and 10 kilometres per hour. It'll depend on, you're putting a lot of roads with 30k where speeds were already low. So they're not going to change, but you've included those for consistency. But on the faster roads, you're going to get a reduction of up to 10 kilometres per hour. Overall, you'll probably get a 2.5K drop in average speeds. But that's the average speed across your whole network. So that is really quite significant. You'll get a reduced pace on the streets. You'll get an increase in cycling and walking, which may be latent. It may take time for that to come through. But it's a community that is making its place a better place to be. And that is what is being done in so many places in the UK. The big mistake would be to think that this is about traffic engineering. It's about marketing and engagement, engagement and engagement. It's all put into the context of community benefits. And benefits go way beyond road safety. And it provides that value-based benefits to compliers. You've got that team, you're including everyone, you're busting the myths. There are a lot of myths. You can see them all busted on our website. And you can create that social norm that 20 or 30 is plenty where people live, work and shop. So that future transition is from a 20th century situation where most urban and residential roads had a 50-kilometre limit and you go slower on some streets, into one where now in the 21st century, most urban and residential roads have a 30K and we go faster only where it's safe and compatible with community needs. And that's why in the UK, from a foundation now of having most of our largest cities at 20 mile an hour, we're actually calling for the central government to actually complete a national 20 mile an hour right by 2020. The Irish solution, I said I wasn't going to tell you what to do, but this is perhaps a nudge as to how you could do it. I said community-led and establishment endorsed. And there's a lot about local authority delivered. The local authority is important because they are most in touch with the people who you want that behaviour change to take place. Recognise the rights of the child and the elderly and pedestrian. You have to have a child-centric view of the road network. You cannot define your values of road safety from behind the steering wheel. You've got to recognise the universal benefit of lower speeds. It goes beyond road safety. But you have to be bold, and you have to have vision in implementing 30K to residents. And you have to work with central government. And I see the central government road as very important. It's a facilitator. And that facilitator means it has to give a very clear leadership and advocacy. And I'm very pleased that in the UK, right, the Minister for Transport is saying, we believe in 20 mile an hour limits, right? There is funding provided, right, and wide funding from different sources. So that is an essential requirement. You cannot ask local authorities, right, to bear all of the cost on their own. And the good thing is, it's a capital expenditure. And it's one where you will get a return year on year on year, which will save you money right in those years to come. So on clear economic basis, you should do it. You need a national media program and engagement. And the sort of national media campaigns that you've got on road safety now can be extended, right, to say this is why we're going 30. This is how it's happening. These are the benefits, and these are how we're all gain. You ease the guidance and your regulations. Make it as simple as possible. Really, it should be made more and more easy for local authorities to do it, and allow a local 30K default with 50K exceptions. And finally, if you do love children, then maybe it really is time to love 30K. Thank you for your attention.